What if everything you think you know about the women inside the Pharaoh's palace is nothing but a carefully polished illusion? What if behind the gold, the perfumes, and the immaculate statues, there was a world built on fear, control, and a silence so deep that even the scribes refused to record it? Have you ever wondered why the official texts praise the greatness of kings, but barely whisper the names of the women who live just a few steps from the throne? This absence is not accidental. It is a clue, a crack in the facade that forces us to ask a darker question. What exactly was happening inside those private chambers that entire dynasties work so hard to erase? When we imagine ancient Egypt, we see elegance, silk moving through candlelight, music echoing in marble halls. But those images were only the surface of a reality shaped by political manipulation, strict surveillance, and punishment disguised as divine order. The women of the palace were not ornaments. They were instruments, in a system where their choices, their bodies, and even their emotions could be controlled. Every smile could be interpreted as loyalty, every sigh as treason. And in a society where the pharaoh was considered a living god, disobeying him was not just rebellion. It was a sin against the cosmos. Inside the palace, the air was thick with unspoken rules. The guards who watched too closely, the advisors who monitored every movement, the women who learned to hide their thoughts behind calm expressions. Some were daughters of noble families sent as political currency. Others were selected for their beauty and raised to believe that their purpose was to serve the throne. Many entered the palace with dreams of influence or comfort, only to discover that their lives were designed to please a power they could never truly reach. And this is where the story becomes even more unsettling. Because the greatest violence was not always physical, it was psychological. A constant reminder that the pharaoh owned everything, including the destiny of every woman under his roof. It is this invisible machinery of control that reveals the true nature of the palace, a place where luxury was a mask and silence was enforced. Have you ever felt that history sometimes hides what matters most? Stay with this thought as we continue. And before we move on, tell me in the comments what struck you the most so far. Leave your like if this topic resonates with you, and make sure you are subscribed to the channel so you do not miss what comes next. What you are about to discover might surprise you, and it is only the beginning, leading us deeper into a world the ancient Egyptians tried so hard to keep buried. The deeper you look into the palace, the more you realize that the silence surrounding these women was not an accident of time, but a deliberate construction. Their presence shaped diplomacy, lineage, and the stability of entire reigns. Yet their names dissolve in the historical record as if they had been ghosts wandering through the corridors. This erasure did not happen because they were unimportant. It happened because their influence was too significant to be acknowledged openly. To recognize their power would have meant revealing how fragile the pharaoh's authority truly was behind the shimmering walls of the palace. Many of these women came from strategic alliances. Powerful families offered daughters to the pharaoh not as gifts, but as political anchors, hoping to tie their bloodline to the throne. These young women carried expectations that could either elevate their households or destroy them entirely. Inside the palace, they learned that a misinterpreted gesture, a misplaced word, or a gaze held a second too long could change everything. Their survival depended on mastering a language of subtlety that few outside the palace ever understood. It was a world where influence was measured in silence, and where the most impactful decisions were made behind curtains, rather than on the battlefield. Yet despite their essential role, the records remain oddly thin. Temples list the pharaoh's victories. Tombs immortalize officials, generals, and priests. But the women who lived closest to the center of power are reduced to vague titles, decorative reliefs, or inscriptions that say nothing about the storms they endured. The scribes were careful. They recorded only what reinforced the image of a stable, divine monarchy. Anything that hinted at internal conflict, rivalry, or manipulation was either softened or omitted entirely. Their importance had to remain hidden to preserve the illusion of a ruler who stood above human weakness. Some women, however, left faint echoes. A few were praised as great royal wives, their images engraved next to the pharaoh as symbols of legitimacy and cosmic balance. But even these rare honors were often overshadowed by the political necessity of portraying the king as the ultimate source of order. Others existed only as silhouettes in murals, unnamed yet vital, their presence silently affirming the grandeur of the throne while their personal stories vanished into the sand. What makes this absence so haunting is the realization that these women shaped the destiny of Egypt from the shadows. They advised, negotiated, calmed tempers, influenced heirs, and quietly redirected decisions that would affect millions. Their world functioned on a knife edge, where every action carried consequences that could ripple across the kingdom. And the deeper we explore their hidden lives, the clearer it becomes that the palace was not simply a place of beauty and ritual. It was a stage where power was constantly shifting, often driven by those who were never meant to be remembered. Their silence was imposed, but it was never empty. It still lingers, waiting to reveal more of what truly happened behind the stone walls the world admires. Inside the palace, the women's silence was not only a product of erasure, but also the result of an intricate system designed to monitor, restrict, and discipline them. The royal harem was far from the romanticized image later cultures created. It was, in truth, a political institution. Every woman represented a potential alliance, a potential threat, or a potential shift in succession. And because of that, the palace constructed a structure of surveillance so thorough that even thoughts felt dangerous. The harem was organized with military precision. There were guards stationed not to protect the women, but to control them. Eunuchs served as intermediaries, carrying messages, enforcing rules, and reporting any behavior that hinted at ambition or dissent. Their loyalty belonged to the pharaoh, not to the women they oversaw, and their presence ensured that no interaction went unnoticed. Even friendships within the harem had to be handled carefully, because alliances could be misread as conspiracies. Information flowed in one direction. The women were constantly watched, yet they knew almost nothing about the world beyond their chambers. The palace controlled what they heard, what they saw, and sometimes even what they were allowed to believe. The goal was simple. A mind that cannot wander cannot resist. A woman who does not know the full extent of her own power is less likely to challenge those who benefit from her silence. Punishments existed, but they rarely needed to be public. The fear of losing favor, losing access, or losing the fragile protection of status was often enough to keep order. A careless remark could result in isolation. A perceived rivalry could lead to reassignment to distant quarters, where a woman would slowly fade from relevance. In more severe cases, disappearances occurred, framed as acts of divine will or unfortunate illness. Nothing was left that could tarnish the pharaoh's carefully curated image. And beneath this rigid control, a subtler form of discipline took root. The women learned to police themselves. They internalized the hierarchy, the expectations and the unspoken rules that shaped every aspect of their lives. Many adapted because adaptation meant survival. Others clung to the hope of influencing the pharaoh, believing proximity could grant a sliver of agency. Yet that desire often placed them deeper within the machinery of control, where every gesture could be used against them. This system worked because it was layered. Visible rules kept order, while the invisible ones broke spirits. The palace did not need chains to restrict the women. It relied on uncertainty, fear, and the promise that obedience could offer a fraction of comfort in a world where everything else belonged to the pharaoh. Through this network of surveillance and subtle coercion, the royal harem became a hidden battlefield where power played out in glances, whispers, and carefully calculated silence. And as we move further into this world, the lines between privilege and imprisonment become harder to distinguish. revealing how deeply the palace relied on control to maintain its illusion of divine authority. The further we move into the private world of the palace, the more it becomes clear that control over these women was not only about surveillance or hierarchy. It was about ownership. Their bodies became extensions of political strategy, tools used to reinforce power, legitimize reigns, and eliminate threats without the need for open conflict. Inside the royal court, physical and psychological violence were woven into everyday life, disguised as ritual, duty, or divine will. For many women, their value was tied to fertility. Bearing a child, especially a potential heir, could elevate a family for generations. Yet this same expectation placed immense pressure on them. When a woman failed to conceive, she was often blamed, scrutinized, and subjected to treatments that ranged from invasive rituals to forced isolation. The palace openly celebrated motherhood, but privately weaponized it, turning what should have been a personal experience into a political battlefield. The violence was not always visible. Some women were forbidden from forming emotional bonds. Others were moved between chambers like pieces on a strategic board, positioned to calm political tensions, or removed to prevent rivalries from escalating. There were cases in which women were intentionally paired with the pharaoh not out of affection, but to neutralize their family's influence or test their loyalty. Their lives shifted according to currents of power they had no control over. Even beauty became a burden. Women chosen for their appearance were expected to maintain a flawless image, knowing that a single perceived imperfection could diminish their standing. This created a climate of constant comparison, where bodies were judged as symbols of favor or disgrace. And behind the golden perfume, many lived with the fear that the same charm that elevated them could someday seal their downfall. Psychological pressure worked as effectively as physical punishment. A woman who spoke too boldly might find herself excluded from gatherings. One who appeared too ambitious could be portrayed as a threat. The palace did not need to leave marks on the skin when it could shape thoughts, emotions, and identities. Some women internalized this control so deeply that they no longer recognized where the pharaoh's expectations ended and their own desires began. Yet what makes this world even more unsettling is how carefully these experiences were concealed. The official records focused on ceremony, devotion, and divine harmony. Nothing in the inscriptions hinted at the silent suffering woven into the daily lives of these women. Their trauma was buried beneath layers of ritual and obedience, preserved only in faint traces that historians must piece together like fragments of a shattered mirror. As you absorb these layers of hidden violence, think about how different history looks when we listen to the voices that were never meant to be heard. If something in this part of the story resonated with you, tell me in the comments. Your insight helps bring these forgotten experiences back into the light, and I would like to know what you felt while hearing this. Among all the women confined within the palace walls, the concubines lived in a particularly fragile space. They were neither fully protected like the great royal wives, nor entirely invisible like lower attendants. Their existence depended on a delicate balance between charm, compliance, and luck, and this unstable position turned their daily lives into a quiet battlefield. The outside world imagined them as privileged, surrounded by luxury, but luxury in the palace was often just a decorative mask placed over a life filled with uncertainty. Every concubine entered the palace with a story. Some were daughters of noble families seeking influence. Others were selected for traits the court found appealing, sometimes as young as early adolescence. Many believed they were entering a world of opportunity, but the truth revealed itself quickly. Their presence was not about personal fulfillment. It was about serving a political structure that viewed them as variables in a broader equation of power. Competition shaped everything. A concubine who caught the pharaoh's attention gained temporary protection, access to better chambers, or small privileges that others envied. But this same attention could spark jealousy, tension, and silent hostility. Alliances formed and dissolved with astonishing speed, often driven by fear rather than loyalty. A whispered rumor, A misinterpreted gesture or an accidental offense could destroy a woman's chances overnight. Rumors were one of the most powerful weapons within the harem. Without freedom to act openly, women learned to navigate influence through subtler means. A single suggestion whispered to a guard or attendant could influence how the court viewed a rival. And because the palace valued order above truth, accusations were not investigated deeply. The appearance of harmony mattered more than justice. The concubines lived with the understanding that they were replaceable. Their fate could shift without warning. One day they might receive gifts or ceremonial recognition, and on the next, they could be reassigned to distant quarters, losing visibility and influence. This constant instability pushed many into emotional exhaustion, yet they maintained outward composure because showing distress was interpreted as weakness, and weakness had consequences. Even moments of kindness had layers of complexity. Bonds formed between women who shared fears or experiences, but affection existed under the shadow of competition. A friend today could become a rival tomorrow. A conversation meant to comfort could later be twisted into evidence of manipulation. Survival required a constant recalibration of trust, a skill learned not by choice, but by necessity. What makes the concubines' world so haunting is not only the pressure they endured, but how completely it was erased from official history. Their names appear rarely, often identified only by titles or vague descriptions. They lived, hoped, feared, and struggled, yet their lives were reduced to footnotes or decorative figures in palace art. The deeper we explore their reality, the clearer it becomes that they inhabited a world defined by invisible wounds, shaped by forces they never controlled. Their story adds another layer to the silence surrounding the Pharaoh's palace, revealing how deeply personal struggles were hidden beneath the polished image of divine order. The great royal wives lived in a world that seemed, at first glance, far removed from the instability faced by concubines. Their titles were carved in stone, their images preserved on temple walls, and their presence publicly acknowledged in rituals that affirmed the pharaoh's divine authority. Yet behind this projection of power and serenity lay a reality marked by constant pressure, intricate expectations, and an ever-present threat of displacement. Their lives were less about comfort and far more about maintaining a carefully constructed illusion that benefited the throne above all else. A great royal wife existed not merely as a companion, but as a symbol. Her marriage represented divine harmony, political stability, and continuity of the royal bloodline. Because of this, every gesture, every word, and every interaction she had within the palace was scrutinized. Even her silence had meaning. She was expected to embody dignity, intelligence, and restraint, but without overshadowing the pharaoh. The role demanded a perfect balance that few could truly maintain, especially in a court filled with rivalries and hidden agendas. These wives were often chosen from powerful families, and while their lineage offered them status, it also made them targets. Any sign of ambition could be interpreted as a challenge to the pharaoh's absolute authority. The palace was quick to react to perceived threats, sometimes stripping women of influence under the guise of maintaining cosmic order. A wife who failed to meet expectations in matters of fertility, diplomacy, or ritual conduct could find herself quietly pushed aside, replaced by another woman more aligned with the needs of the moment. The luxury that surrounded them was never a guarantee of safety. Their chambers, adorned with fine linens and offerings, were still confined spaces where their lives were dictated by cycles of ritual and political necessity. Even in public, their presence was choreographed. Their appearance at ceremonies served as a visual reminder of unity and divine legitimacy, but little about their true thoughts or desires ever surfaced. Their smiles, immortalized in art, concealed countless fears and sacrifices. While the concubines navigated the shifting sands of internal competition, the great royal wives faced a more rigid yet equally demanding path. They were expected to sustain the royal narrative, uphold dynastic continuity, and maintain an unbreakable composure. Their influence, though significant, was always precarious. A whisper of discontent within the court, a failed attempt to produce an heir, or a political misstep by their family could weaken their standing overnight. Despite their elevated status, their experiences were often omitted from official records. Historians find fragments of their lives only through scattered inscriptions, objects, buried in tombs, or rare mentions in royal decrees. These traces reveal not just their ceremonial importance, but the constant tension between their public roles and private realities. They lived at the intersection of honor and pressure, carrying responsibilities that were both immense and impossibly restrictive. Their world was polished stone on the outside and fragile ground beneath the surface. And as we follow the hidden threads of their lives, the palace begins to reveal itself not as a place of privilege, but as a structure built on control, sacrifice, and silent resilience. As the layers of the palace unravel, a darker truth becomes impossible to ignore. The royal court did not rely solely on ritual and hierarchy to maintain order. It also depended on consequences severe enough to instill fear in every woman who lived beneath its roof. Punishments were woven into the fabric of palace life, sometimes subtle, sometimes brutal, and almost always hidden from the official record. The scribes who shaped the narrative of Egypt were experts at preserving the pharaoh's image while burying anything that hinted at disorder or internal violence. Some punishments began as quiet warnings. A woman who displeased the pharaoh, or whose family fell out of political favor, might suddenly lose access to certain areas of the palace. She could be isolated, reassigned, or stripped of small privileges that were essential to her status. These measures, though invisible to the outside world, carried psychological weight. Isolation was one of the most effective tools of control. Removed from familiar faces and daily routines, a woman could slowly lose her sense of identity, becoming easier to manipulate or erase. But other cases were far more severe. Historical whispers, found in damaged papyri or inconsistent inscriptions, suggest that disappearances were not uncommon. A woman involved in a suspected conspiracy, whether true or fabricated for convenience, could vanish without explanation. Her absence would be sanitized as illness or divine judgment. The palace rarely left traces of its darkest actions, but the patterns speak for themselves. When a threat arose, the court reacted with precision, ensuring no scandal ever touched the pharaoh's public image. Assassinations were not always dramatic. They often took the form of quiet poisonings, sudden illnesses, or ceremonial accidents that drew no suspicion. If a woman possessed knowledge that endangered influential figures, or if her loyalty was questioned at a delicate political moment, her story could end abruptly. These events were rarely questioned, because questioning meant challenging the divine order, and that was a risk few courtiers were willing to take. Even the great royal wives were not immune. A shift in alliances, a failed pregnancy, or a whisper of discontent could position them as obstacles rather than assets. And once the palace deemed a woman inconvenient, the machinery of control moved swiftly. What makes this even more unsettling is how efficiently the scribes erased these incidents. Their duty was not to preserve truth, but to craft an unshakable narrative of stability and divine rule. Any trace of punishment or violence threatened that narrative and was therefore removed. Yet fragments remain. A broken relief depicting a woman whose name was chiseled out. A decree mentioning an unexpected change in palace hierarchy. A tomb inscription where a wife praises a pharaoh but omits her own story entirely. These fragments reveal a shadow history, one defined not by grand monuments, but by fear, secrecy, and the silent desperation of those who lived close to absolute power. If something in this hidden side of the story made you reflect or sparked a thought you had not considered before, share it with me in the comments. I would like to know what part of this dark chapter resonated with you the most. The more we explore, the deeper layers of the palace, the clearer it becomes that control was not enforced solely through punishment or physical coercion. The most effective weapon the court possessed was psychological engineering, a slow and deliberate shaping of identity designed to make resistance feel impossible. The women of the palace lived within a mental landscape, crafted to confine them as thoroughly as any physical barrier could, and this form of control left no marks that the outside world could see. From the moment a woman entered the palace, she was separated from the life she once knew. Her routines changed. Her speech was monitored. Her interactions were filtered through attendants and guards who reported everything to higher authorities. Over time, this constant observation transformed into self-surveillance. The women learned to anticipate expectations, to censor their own thoughts, and to mold themselves into versions the palace found acceptable. This was the first step in breaking their will, not by force, but by conditioning. The palace also manipulated isolation with precision. A woman might be surrounded by luxury and attendance, yet emotionally she lived in solitude. Genuine friendships were rare, not because the women lacked empathy, but because trust was a dangerous luxury. Any bond could be interpreted as an alliance. Any shared frustration could be twisted into a conspiracy. This environment made every conversation calculated, and every silence heavy. Slowly, the sense of belonging dissolved, replaced by a feeling that only absolute obedience could guarantee safety. Another method the court used was the manipulation of time. The palace operated on strict cycles of rituals, rehearsals, and appearances, creating a rhythm that left little space for women to reflect on their own desires. Days blurred into one another, filled with obligations that reinforced their secondary status. In such an environment, personal ambition or hope became distractions, fading under the weight of ritualistic repetition. The palace did not need to forbid dreams. It simply buried them under routines that made dreaming feel futile. Identity, too, was reshaped. Women were often given new titles, new roles, and even new names, each chosen to reflect their position within the palace hierarchy rather than their individuality. Over time, many internalized these imposed identities, accepting them as the only versions of themselves the world would ever acknowledge. This was one of the court's most subtle techniques: altering self-perception until compliance felt natural, even inevitable. Flattery also played its part. A woman might be praised, given small privileges, or made to feel momentarily valued, only to have those gestures withdrawn without explanation. The unpredictability created emotional dependence, making the women more vulnerable to manipulation. They were taught to associate obedience with temporary rewards and doubt with punishment or exclusion. This cycle left them searching constantly for approval, from a system designed never to grant it fully. And beneath all of this was the unspoken truth that the palace itself was a stage. Every gesture, every smile, every step had meaning. The women lived, knowing that they were always being watched, evaluated, and categorized. Their inner world became a battleground between fear, resilience, and survival. What remained was a fragmented sense of self, shaped not by personal choice, but by the invisible hands of those who ruled from the shadows. Even in a world built to suppress individuality, there were women who refused to let the palace shape their identity entirely. Their resistance, whether intentional or instinctive, reveals another side of life behind the Pharaohs' walls. These women challenged the rules in ways that today might seem small, but within the rigid structure of the harem, their actions carried immense weight. And the consequences they faced exposed just how fragile the boundaries of power truly were. Some resisted through intellect. They asked questions that unsettled advisors, showed curiosity beyond what was considered appropriate, or displayed strategic thinking that rivaled that of high-ranking officials. Their intelligence, instead of being nurtured, became a threat. The palace thrived on predictability and control. A woman who could interpret politics, understand alliances, or read the intentions of courtiers disrupted the delicate balance that kept the pharaoh at the center of every decision. Others defied expectations through emotional strength. A woman who refused to be broken by isolation, who maintained a sense of identity, or who comforted others, challenged the machinery of psychological manipulation. Emotional resilience created pockets of stability within the palace, small but significant acts that weakened the effectiveness of the systems designed to control them. Yet resilience, in the eyes of those who governed the court, was a form of resistance that required correction. There were women whose defiance took the form of seeking genuine connection. They attempted to build alliances rooted not in competition, but in solidarity, a dangerous choice in an environment that punished loyalty to anyone other than the pharaoh. These bonds, though often hidden, gave rise to whispers of shared struggle and quiet courage. And when discovered, they were treated as conspiracies, regardless of their true nature. Some defiance was driven by survival. When the palace targeted them unfairly, women sometimes sought support from influential families or sympathetic officials. These pleas for protection, however, could be twisted into political maneuvering. The court often saw these moves as attempts to manipulate power, even when motivated by desperation rather than ambition. In such cases, the palace responded swiftly, using punishment to neutralize what it perceived as instability. The most dangerous form of resistance, however, came from women who refused to follow the emotional script the palace imposed. A woman who did not display gratitude for small privileges, who questioned decisions, or who expressed sorrow too openly, disrupted the image of harmony the pharaoh needed to project. Her emotions became ammunition against her, interpreted as signs of disloyalty or hidden intentions. The consequences for resistance varied. Some women were gradually erased from the daily routines of the palace, their presence fading into irrelevance. Others were transferred to more restrictive quarters or separated from anyone who might support them. A few faced harsher fates, disappearing from records entirely, their stories sealed behind layers of silence that historians now struggle to decode. These women, though unnamed in official history, left imprints in the spaces between inscriptions. Their courage reveals that even in the most controlled environments, human spirit finds ways to push back. Their whispered acts of defiance remind us that behind every statue, every mural, and every title carved in stone, there were real lives, shaped by fear, but also by a determination that the palace could never fully extinguish. After centuries of careful erasure, what remains of these women's lives is fragmentary, almost ghost-like. Their names, their stories, their struggles are rarely recorded in the annals of pharaonic history. Yet traces survive, in hidden chambers, in faint inscriptions, in objects that once passed through their hands. These remnants tell a story that the palace itself sought to suppress, a tale of resilience, courage, and endurance in the face of a system designed to annihilate individuality. The pharaohs built monuments, temples, and tombs to glorify their reigns, but the real lives that shaped the course of the palace, the decisions that influenced dynasties, were often lived in shadows. Even today, the echoes of these women are found in archaeological fragments. A carved symbol in an obscure chamber, a tablet detailing minor transactions, a mural where a woman is depicted without a name. Each element hints at the intricate, often dangerous roles they played. Their influence was subtle, but it shaped politics, succession, and the very functioning of the court. And though the scribes erased most, these traces remind us that history is never truly silent. Voices can survive, even when deliberately obscured, if we are willing to look beyond the grand narratives. The palace's system of control relied on invisibility. The women were instruments, objects, vessels, yet they were also intelligent, adaptive, and often remarkably cunning. Some learned to manipulate the very rules imposed upon them, using intelligence, charm, or subtle alliances to survive and occasionally influence events in ways that no record fully captures. Others endured without visible agency, holding on to private rituals, silent prayers, and acts of defiance that could never be documented. Their lives were hidden, but they mattered. Understanding this, shadow history is crucial. It reveals how power operates not only through force, but through the systematic manipulation of people's identities, relationships, and emotions. These women were not merely victims. They were participants in a complex political ecosystem where survival required strategy, compliance, and, in rare cases, quiet rebellion. The palace was a machine, but it was never entirely unchallenged. Every whisper of dissent, every subtle act of resistance chipped away at the illusion of total control. If you have followed this story to the end, you have already glimpsed the hidden reality of the Pharaoh's palace. I encourage you to leave a comment sharing which part of this secret history affected you the most, or how it changed the way you think about power and control. Don't forget to give this video a like if it resonated with you, and make sure you are subscribed to the channel to continue exploring the stories that history tried to hide. There's more waiting just beyond this tale, a next journey into the shadows where the voices of the past still speak, and you will not want to miss what comes next.